You wake up with no memories on a cold metal slab, surrounded by bodies in various states of dissection and shambling undead going about their daily tasks. A floating skull greets you and reveals that you have a message tattooed on your back, instructions on how to proceed in regards to your blank mind. You find out that death is a mere setback for you. No matter the circumstance, you always come back, recovering from even the most horrific of wounds. After escaping the morbid halls of your awakening, you go on a journey across Sigil, the city of portals and other such mystifying locations. You buy back your own eye from a barman, converse with beings beyond mortal comprehension, draw kindred souls to your side, and confront the consequences of your actions, intended or not. You experience a journey of self-discovery set as the backdrop of a single, inescapable question. What can change the nature of a man? That is Planescape Torment, arguably one of the best written role-playing games of all time, created by Chris Avallone, arguably one of the best role-playing video game writers of all time. To say that Torment occupies a special place in the heart of the hardcore RPG crowd would be an understatement. It is the kind of game from 1999 that you play today and then wonder, wow, where did video games go wrong? Which isn't to say that it is flawless, far from it in fact. But what it does well is unique and executed with a razor-sharp focus, which perhaps is what truly matters. Works such as Planescape Torment are the polar opposite of mediocrity. Now, you would think that such a game has a certain aura of sacrality. It is an internally consistent and enclosed experience, through and through. Not exactly the best material for a continuation, but we live in the Kickstarter age, my friends. Crowdfunding lives and dies on how well it entices and hooks people on nostalgia, like a crack dealer of fond memories. So in 2013 we got the Torment, Tides of Numenera Kickstarter by inXile, a spiritual successor set in a science fantasy setting. It got funded rapidly and 4 years later we have the game, which can be considered special in this day and age. You see, the original was not something that could be easily described as digestible. You spent a lot of time running around, talking, reading journals and figuring out the occasional puzzle. That is the core next to which combat encounters seemed heavily superficial and tedious most of the time, particularly since character building was not a focus. This actually drew ire when the game was released in 1999, since it was based on the Infinity engine of Baldur's Gate fame. A game all about fighting and character building. Only with time did Planescape Torment gain its legendary status. Torment Tides of Numenera manages to actually keep the core intact. It is a wordy game about investigating mysteries and talking to people rather than plowing through combat encounters, of which there are only about a dozen or so. And even when they do happen, they are framed in the context of the crisis system, where possibilities such as using stealth, environmental factors, or just straight up talking to your enemies are present, if not outright encouraged. I think you can count the amount of times where the game absolutely forces you to engage in combat on a single hand. From a certain perspective, this can be viewed as an evolution of RPG design in general. After all, blending fighting and non-fighting skills in a combat scenario is something that you might see in pen and paper games, but very rarely implemented in their video game counterparts, and almost never well. But the devil is in the details, and it is details that made games such as Planescape Torment what they are. Much like the original, Torment Tides of Numenera revolves around the concept of past lives. The Changing God is a super genius space wizard that can create bodies and then transfer his consciousness at a moment's notice, but when he does that, the discarded body gains sentience. These new entities are called cast-offs, and the protagonist is one such being. After going through a mental construct that acts as the character building segment, you awake to find that you crash-landed on Earth and somehow survived this. You see, the Changing God modifies his chosen bodies to fit his needs, and after vacating the premises, the cast-off inherits the body with powers intact. In the protagonist's case, this means perfect regeneration, much in the same way the Nameless One from Planescape Torment could regenerate from any wound. And much like the Nameless One, you are chased by shadowy monsters collectively called the Sorrow, which seem to want to erase you at all costs. With only the vague memory that an object called the Resonance Chamber next to which you crash-landed might help, you embark on a journey to find a way to save yourself, and find out the secret behind the Changing God's machinations. Quite a familiar premise, in fact some might say too familiar, but before we get to the comparison between Torment games, we need to talk about the comparison between the two settings, Planescape and Numenera. I was not very excited about this game's launch, to be honest. Why? Because I hate Numenera. Made by Monty Cook, a pen and paper designer of Dungeons & Dragons fame, and funded by Kickstarter, much like the video game, it is a very simple and straightforward storytelling experience about sci-fi shenanigans where anything can happen. You know that quote by Arthur C. Clarke, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic"? Well, Numenera is that in the worst way possible. It takes place billions of years in the future with innumerable artifacts from countless civilizations strewn about the place. You got aliens, parallel dimensions, time travel, essentially almost every single trope vaguely associated with science fiction is mashed together here. Look, you can have a world where anything can happen, but you can't have a world where everything can happen at the same time. It's just random then. The architecture in-game reflects the issue with this setting perfectly. Just look at the buildings, it is a nonsensical mishmash that has no coherence. I get that they're supposed to be remnants of past civilizations, but logically they would either be beneath or away from quote-unquote modern civilization. Instead, we have this insane smorgasbord of architectural styles that make no sense being right next to each other. This type of setting also invites a tendency of making special snowflake characters that are as weird as possible in an effort to one-up each other. I mean, you have merchants that unironically sell migraines. Why? Who would buy that? It's just weird for weirdness' sake. Planescape, on the other hand, handles its strange mythos much better. The center of it all was Sigil, a city where portals are everywhere, but the keys to said portals could be anything, from a crooked branch to a loving memory. It was the type of place where angels and demons would hang out in a bar together, a place where you could see anything. Unlike Numenera, this is a place with a few but very harsh rules. Sigil is ruled by the Lady of Pain, an entity who is more powerful than gods, thus keeping them out of her city, and who has servants called Dabus, which go about keeping the city in a functional state. Cross this Lady of Pain and you die. Doesn't matter who you are, you die. In fact, messing with her is one of the few ways you can get an actual game over screen in Planescape Torment. And since the setting was already very weird to start with, the game goes lower rather than higher in terms of what you generally encounter. A man praying for a tree to grow, another lamenting the living while chiseling the names of the dead on walls. These things are highly dubious from our perspective, but the actions themselves are quite simple and non-spectacular. After some time with the game, you can easily see how people can lead mundane lives even in a place such as this. Meanwhile, in Torment Tides of Numenera, in the first major hub, you have a creature trapped in time so it can recall the downfall of its race, a clock that seems to shift between different realities, a fountain made out of little flying worms that are born when a language dies, an archway that sends children across time to find foster parents, and so on and so forth. The problem is that once you get into the mindset of everything I'm going to meet is going to be fantastically random, you can't really be surprised anymore. So if this game was going to have good writing, it was in spite of the setting, not because of it. Sadly, this is not the case. Let us read this little exchange from the beginning of the game. You ask, what kind of dangers are there in the reef? The response is, myriad. We walk among the Numenera, detritus of fallen worlds and antediluvian wars. Sorry, what now? What was that word just now? Antediluvian. Antediluvian is a word belonging to the Abrahamic mythological canon. It is a religious term that means before the flood. Over time, it has become a soft synonym for ancient. But this secondary meaning is fully derived from the first one, and using such a word in a culture that has no conception of the primary meaning isn't just bad writing, it is indicative of a bad writer. Many works of fictions recontextualize cultural terms such as Shiva in Final Fantasy being this ice lady instead of the Hindu deity. But you need to be very clear when you do such a thing. Tides of Numenera doesn't do this in regards to the biblical flood concept, thus the writer simply fished out a synonym for ancient without thinking of its various meanings. And the thinking which led to the misuse of this word characterizes the rest of the bad writing. It is mindlessly bloated. The absence of an editor to chainsaw the fat is felt throughout. This game loves the adjective and adjective descriptions. Everything is warm and moist, humid and dank, ancient and cold. They love it. Unfortunately, most of it is redundant like the vast majority of the writing. Everything is overly descriptive to the point of ridiculousness. Boring things described in detail don't magically become interesting. This is basic writing knowledge. For example, you meet a happy couple at one point, and throughout the conversation, there are like 5 to 6 paragraphs worth of descriptive text that points out the blindingly obvious. They are happy and they are nervous about their kid, I get it. It is even worse when there are very accurate, very easy to see visual cues and the game still rambles on about things you have in front of your eyes. This is a visual medium. When the visual tells a story, use the writing for the stories which can't be visually represented. No other place in the game represents the flaws of the writing so strongly as the intro. It starts with an overly dramatic falling to earth section, followed by 5 mandatory memory sections whose role in character creation is minimal. You're still going to make most of the important decisions, and you can ignore the small thing that is suggested by the game anyway. Then you wake up and converse with the most boring companions in the entire game, who more or less vomit exposition at you. It is a textbook example of how to not start a text-heavy game. That being said, what about the reverse question? Is there any good writing at all? Well, given that the game featured guest writers, the answer would be yes, but they are mostly self-contained pieces of writing and somewhat detached from the experience. Rin is a companion character created by Patrick Rothfuss, a proper writer and one of the Kickstarter stretch goals. I fully admit she's one of the more interesting and meta companions I've seen in a role-playing game. She's actually one of the reasons I played the game to the end. Rin is an amnesia-suffering runaway child that has an imaginary friend in the form of a rock that may or may not have special powers. And she just wants to go home, wherever that might be. She is the weakest companion character in the game in terms of stats, and people will chastise you for carrying a kid around while going on a very dangerous journey. But she's also a very humane character that has the sort of unwavering childlike moral compass that brings a good amount of weight to your actions. When everybody is either crazy or cynical, a child saying what is good or bad can be very interesting. There are multiple ways her story can unfold, but there is a decidedly good path you can take. I don't want to spoil it, but I will say that she has the most character development out of anybody in the game if you manage to find this path for her. Besides Ren, there's also Eretis, a companion surrounded by a golden glow and who seeks heroic adventure to the point of lunacy. He is written by Chris Avallone, and I don't think I need to add anything else. There are also a few flashback sequences and a cult leader character written by Mark Yohalem of Primordia fame.
Oh, hi Mark.
These sequences are more than competent, especially in comparison to the core Torment writing team. But in the end, that is about it. That is all that stood out. The rest of the writing is either mediocre or subpar, which is pretty bad for a game heavily focused on text. And notice that none of the good parts I mentioned are in the main story. A main story which suffers from being a bad reimagining of Torment in a new setting. I'll have to discuss some story elements to go into the specifics, so click on the annotation to skip this part if you don't want spoilers. The game reveals far too much from the very beginning. You already know you are not the changing god. You already know that a creature called the Sorrow is chasing you. You already know that you're super special among the other cast-offs. The journey is lacking in bite and surprise. Most of the time, you're just looking for one person after the other in something that feels far too video gamey rather than a personal story. Repair the Resonance Chamber by finding Matnica, then find Mazov by going to the Cast-Off Sanctuary, then find the first Cast-Off, which is somewhere else, and once you do that, the game ends. In between all that chasing around, there is either exposition dumps or flashbacks about the changing god or other characters. Since you already know you are not this character, then it is much harder to get invested in all this background info. In Planescape Torment, you experience the story. In Torment Tides of Numenera, you are told a story. You never feel like you're doing something you would do, but rather you are just doing what the game instructs you to do. Hell, it doesn't even really matter how you go about the journey, whether you are a goody two-shoes or a mass-murdering psychopath. And of course, there are also massive plot holes, because when the writing is this bad, then those naturally follow. My favorite and most blatant is this one. You have people telling you that an organic city called the Bloom is one of the few places safe from the Sorrow. At one point, you escape by teleporting to said Bloom, and the description tells you that the Sorrow is immensely angry at the fact that it cannot follow you, and finally Oh, well then. Never mind. No explanation given on how it managed to contradict what was said about appearing in the Bloom. And also, since we're here, small side note, why is it called the Sorrow? In Planescape, these creatures being called Sorrows made sense, they were tragic figures. In Numenera, it is called the Sorrow for no other reason than a reference. Its background is more of a guardian than a tortured being. But moving beyond the details, probably my biggest issue with the story is its lack of theming a la Planescape Torment. The whole thing revolves around a father who wants to bring back his daughter from the dead at all costs, but the actual character of the changing god is just so quaint. He lacks any sort of idiosyncrasies in his speech and thoughts to give you the feeling of this towering intellect who has seen and done so many things across a multitude of lifetimes. He also lacks an emotional edge to convince the audience that he went through all of this just to resurrect his daughter, thus making the premise of the story, what does one life matter, fall flat philosophically due to the way it's told and also because of how impersonal it is. Especially in comparison to Planescape Torment. The "what can change the nature of a man" question concerns the main character directly. In Torment Tides of Numenera, the "what does one life matter" question concerns the main character indirectly or not at all. In fact, the plot invalidates the premise. At the end, the sorrow more or less gives you 3 main endings. Destroy it to save the cast-offs at the cost of doing damage to the minds of many people, fuse all the consciousness of the cast-offs in one body, or keep the status quo by doing nothing. These choices don't concern a single person. You have the weight of your entire kind to consider, not just the changing god's dead daughter or even your own well-being. Regardless, I highly doubt that people were asking for a bad reimagining of Torment in a worse setting with references shotgun all over the place when they saw the Kickstarter pitch. What they wanted was an experience similar to what Torment offered, which is something stylistic rather than narrative. Planescape Torment was made good by its mystery. Trying to follow so closely in its footsteps is foolhardy since you can't capture the same mystery twice when you are selling it to an audience who knows how the story goes. Now, about combining the writing and gameplay. The tides are probably the most important aspect here, a sort of invisible psychic energy innately tied to reality and emotions. I think it isn't very clearly explained. In gameplay terms, there are 5 types of tides by color and they reflect different personalities rather than morality. Be forward in your dealings and your tide is red, but question everything and your tide shall be blue. What is the consequence of having a particular color of tide? Having a particular color of tide. The loading screen tooltips tell you that there are slight changes to dialogue, but I'll be damned if I have ever seen anything related to that. There are barely any references to color in-game as well. People talk about the tides, but nobody goes, "Ah, you have a golden tide, you will surely help me." Likewise, you don't get information on other people's tides as a sort of tip regarding their personality, so everything regarding the color of the tides is pure set dressing, no exclusive quests, items, or anything of the sort. The actual function of the tides is as a skill that you can learn at various moments, and it allows you to Jedi mind trick your way to victory. It is fine, it is another tool under your belt, but it in no way rises to the premise of what tides were promised to represent. Same goes for the Labyrinth, a visual representation of your mind that you can access when you kill yourself. A neat idea that barely has any use. You spend a bit of time at the start and at the end, in between accessing it for the purpose of talking to various NPCs in your head. Like I said, neat idea, you can even get bonuses in gameplay from absorbing other minds, but it's too shallow in terms of interactivity for me to recommend. It could have been an excellent player stronghold of sorts, but it is not. That kinda describes the gameplay in general. It could have been excellent, but it is not. The ideas are not bad, but the execution is atrocious at times. The core of the game is centered, same as the pen and paper version, on stat pools. Each character has 3 pools of stats which are might, speed and intellect. When you are asked to do a skill check, you can spend points of corresponding pools to increase the percentile chance of success. When in combat, attacks function in the same way by spending points to increase the damage and chance to hit. Note that some abilities have a specific cost to pay before use. Beyond that though, there are one-use items called ciphers which trivialize most encounters and general generic itemization. That is about it. It is quite simple and leads to rather underwhelming character building, which is not a big issue, in my opinion at least, since it's not a direct focus of the game, same as Planescape. But it is surprising how many flaws were inherited from that game. You can be a glaive, a jack or a nano, which correlates with the fighter, thief and mage from Planescape. And trust me, you want the intellectually focused class, in both games, which would be the mage or the nano respectively. Intellect skill checks vastly outweigh the speed or might ones, especially when it comes to personal usage. You see, in Torment Tides of Numenera, your companions can make skill checks for you, even when it doesn't really make sense. There are some exceptions to this where you cannot rely on help, but most of them revolve around memories or mental challenges, which fall squarely in the intellect skill check area. And even without companions, your character gets so overpowered in terms of raw stats that most of the time it feels that the whole concept of trying to pass skill checks is superfluous. Just focus on intellect a bit more than speed and might, then you're gold. However, there is another reason why you really want to play a nano, and it leaves all other character choices in the dust. Scan thoughts, aka mind reading. It offers some interesting bits of description at times, and while there are frustrating moments where you can't really follow up on what you've learned, it really feels like the way you're supposed to experience this game. Unfortunately, you have no choice but to experience the crisis system when it comes to dealing with possible combat situations, and that's not a good thing at all. Like I said, I actually like the idea and how you can use other means besides fighting to get stuff done. I mean, it is still shallow at times, but then again, so is passing a single skill check and dialogue to bypass combat completely. But the glaring, crippling issue that makes them unbearable is the speed. It is slow. It is so slow. The animations move at a glacial pace. It takes forever to get anything done, and rather than keeping this issue under control with smart encounter design, they manage to make it even worse. Large amounts of enemies, respawning enemies, wandering enemies that trigger other packs of enemies to join the fray. It is like they made it a point to have as many enemies as possible on the screen, which turns the whole process from slow to agonizingly slow. Combined with an interface that is amateurish at best, and you have a recipe for disaster. Shout out to whoever decided to have this little sound and UI animation play whenever you talk to someone. You have succeeded in being annoying in ways you cannot imagine. I do hope that the concept of the crisis system will be used to much better effect in another game, but in no way is the potential shown in Torment Molasses of Numenera. I will give Torment a most prestigious accolade. It was the least painful to complete Kickstarter RPG of those that I did not like. Give it up, folks, a true achievement here. Wasteland 2 had some good bits towards the end, but the first 30 hours were an agonizing tedium. Pillars of Eternity just bored me to tears after Radoric's hold. Torment Tides of Numenera either got me angry or very rarely impressed with some bits of good writing, but I did feel like I was moving towards something, however bad. There is also the fact that there is some interesting interactivity here and there, which is something I appreciate. For example, there is this item called the Transdimensional Scalpel, which allows you to cut through multiple quests. I don't want to oversell it though, the areas are so small that these occasional moments of reactivity feel very gamey, but they are there. So yes, it is a bad experience in the end, but it was the most digestible out of all the bad experiences of its peers. Yippee. What else can be said in closing? I'm not angry about the game. The moment I heard that Numenera is the setting, my expectations dropped and kept dropping throughout hearing development news. Still, I didn't think it would be such an underwhelming experience. If anything, it makes me sad that we will probably never see an RPG of the same quality as Planescape Torment for a long time. But I will say that I am happy that Torment Tides of Numenera didn't destroy my mental image of its inspiration. If anything, it made it stronger.